Hello. Time to begin. Just got to turn my monitor on here so I can see what I'm doing. All right. We ended with the kings of Judah. We talked about the kings of Israel as well. Just a few little notes about them, not an exhaustive history. But we will be talking about some of the foreign kings today. We're going to start with Pharaoh Shishak, or Shishonk as he's known by Egyptian sources. The Bible records him in 1 Kings 11 and 14. Now there are several Shishonks, 7 of them, but only one that had a campaign in Canaan when the Bible said it did. Excuse me. He was the first king of the 22nd dynasty, a military commander of the 21st, and there were some patchy records, but he seems to have taken the throne without a struggle, which is suspect, but for all intents and purposes, seems to be the case. He was a notable person. You have his little symbol there, his scarabs that have the symbol on it, so we know he was legitimately an Egyptian king. He has a relief at the Great Temple at Karnak in Luxor, Egypt. This we had talked about before. He listed the places that he had conquered, and he campaigned in the Levant, in the land of Israel and Judah, about 926 BC. This is soon after Solomon's death. He listed over 150 places he had conquered: Gibeon, Arad, Gezer, Megiddo, even a place called the Field of Abraham, which may be Hebron, and there are many other on there, many other lists, places on this list. We even have fragments from where he actually fought. They would leave that victory stele there, and we found a fragment of that at Megiddo. But what is interesting is the Bible says that he came to Jerusalem, yet we do not find Jerusalem on this list. Now, it may be that it was just one of the names that were worn away. Or, since Rehoboam paid him off, it wasn't actually a conquest. Remember, Rehoboam gave all the treasures of the palace as well as the temple to Shishonk, and made him go away, paid him off. Or this could be what is meant when it lists David there. We talked about how this is David, and this could be a reference to the city of David. So any of these three could fit, but we do have him campaigning in this area. And we see something else. Now this was in the middle of Egypt's third intermediate phase. That's when Egypt was at a low power point, when Egypt wasn't in full control of everything. Basically, one of its periods where it wasn't a great power. And yet, this man was very, very wealthy. We have him there, I believe that's his son, or Sokin. His son erected a great pillar in eastern Nile Delta and gave 383 tons of gold to the deities of Egypt. Today, that would be $21 billion. And that's what he gave away. And then the grandson, Shishak II, they died and they put him in a coffin of pure silver. It's really surprising that that wasn't stolen in antiquity, but we have it today. This shows that Shishak accumulated great wealth, but this was again in Egypt's down period, in its intermediate period when it wasn't strong. And it really boggles the mind how he could have gotten so much wealth. The places that he was attacking weren't that big of a places. They weren't the Hittites, they weren't the Assyrians, they weren't major powers from the archaeological point of view. Yet the Bible says that Solomon had great, great wealth. Silver without measure. This makes perfect sense if he went away with all the gold and treasures of Solomon. We next have Tiglath-Pileser III. We talked about him a little bit last time, but he was one of the most powerful Assyrian kings in this era. So this is after the Bronze Age collapse, when all the other powers were basically just weakened for some reason. This is when David and Solomon came up. Well, Assyria then, after its collapse, was being built back up, and he's one of the ones that helped build them back up. He is known from this Enkrili stele, which is a boundary stone, and it is Phoenician. The inscription is Phoenician, and it's dated to the 8th century BC. It refers to him as Pulu, the great king of Assyria. So he is one with two names, Tiglath-Pileser and Pulu. I guess a nickname of sorts. It says that in 745, he led a coup and made a standing army, stabilized and expanded Assyria, basically merging Assyria and Babylon into one. And this continued for 100 years after him. Now, Babylon would then, do its thing. But first, Assyria was the great power. We have him interacting with a number of kings in the Kings and Chronicles accounts, in the biblical account. He interacts with Uzziah, or at least mentions him. Ahaz pays him tribute. Hoshea, the last king of Israel, was put on the throne by him. Pekah, the king before, who was killed because of him, and Menahem, a king of Israel, that, again, paid him tribute. The first mention is Menahem, so 752 to 742 BC. In 2 Kings it says, Then Pul, king of Assyria, invaded the land, and Menahem gave him 1,000 talents of silver to gain his support and strengthen his own hold on the kingdom. The stele of Tiglath-Pileser III names Menahem of Samaria as one of the kings who brought him tribute. So we see both accounts agree. In 2 Kings 16, we have Ahaz. Ahaz sent messengers to King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria with this message. I am your servant. I am like a son to you. Come and save me from the king of Aram and the king of Israel. They have come to fight me. Ahaz also took the silver and gold that was in the temple of the Lord and the treasuries of the king's palace. Then Ahaz sent a gift to the king of Assyria. The king of Assyria listened to Ahaz and went to fight against Damascus. The king captured the city and took the people from Damascus as prisoners to Kir. He also killed Rezin. The Annals of Tiglath-Pileser III from Nimrod lists a group of kings in the Levant, and that includes Jehoahaz. So we don't have as much detail as the biblical account gives, but we do have a mentioning of a similar event. We also have in the Bible him going in and capturing, 2 Kings 15:29. This is when he's attacking Omri land, as he would have called it, or Israel. King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria came to fight against Israel while Pekah was king of Israel. Tiglath-Pileser captured Ejin, Abel, Beth-Maacah, Joanna, Kedesh, Hazor, Gilead, and Galilee, and all the areas of Naphtali. He took the people from these places as prisoners to Assyria. So we see one of the first deportations, the taking of Israelis as prisoners away to Assyria. We then see him putting Hoshea on the throne. In 2 Kings 15:30, Hoshea, son of Elah, made plans against Pekah, son of Remaliah, and killed him. Then Hoshea became the new king. This was during the 20th year that Jotham, son of Uzziah, was king of Judah. We know a little bit more about this from the Annals of Tiglath, saying that he took money from Hoshea, 10 talents of gold and 1,000 talents of silver, in order to do this. So we see that Tiglath comes in, attacks Israel, and makes them change their kingship. He does so in an underhanded way, basically just supplying Hoshea with what he needs to take care of Pekah. But still, he does that for this money, we find out. We're finding out a lot of the intrigue that Hoshea did in order to become king. What he paid was $27 million in silver and $18 million in gold. Then, when Tiglath-Pileser dies, Hoshea then rebels, and that doesn't end well for him. The next king that we're going to talk about is King Sennacherib. Now, this is not the next king in the Assyrian list. The Assyrian list goes Tiglath-Pileser III, then Shalmaneser, the one who attacked Hoshea, then Sargon II. This is the one that took claim for Israel being taken away. We talked about that last time. And remember, Shalmaneser only reigned 5 years. The siege of Samaria took 2.5 years at least, 2 to 3 years. And so it makes sense that it could have been Sargon, it could have been Shalmaneser. We don't really hear anything about Sargon, and then Sennacherib comes along. Sennacherib is the one that attacked Hezekiah. We talked a little bit about his attack of Lachish. We have stone panels from the palace of Nineveh of this attack. We have both the biblical as well as the Assyrian records, so we're going to get both perspectives on this. In the Assyrian account, it says, As to Hezekiah the Jew, he did not submit to my yoke. I laid siege to 46 of his strong cities and conquered them. Himself I made a prisoner in Jerusalem, his royal residence. Like a bird in a cage, I surrounded him with earthwork. This was not his intention. He destroyed 46 of his strong cities. He wanted to take Hezekiah, but he couldn't. These were ferocious men. Even by their own account, it says, his foremost officials I impaled alive on stakes and caused his country to behold it. These were known as ferocious people in the ancient world. They were. They lived up to their reputation. It makes little wonder why Jonah didn't really want to go to these people. But for some reason, they couldn't take Hezekiah. They couldn't take Jerusalem. In 2 Kings 19, we find out why. God says, I will defend this city and save it, for my sake and for the sake of David my servant. That night the angel of the Lord went out and put to death 185,000 in the Assyrian camp. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, broke camp and withdrew. He returned to Nineveh and stayed there. In the Assyrian account, we see Hezekiah did send me later to Nineveh, my lordly city, together with 30 talents of gold. He got that money. We know that in the biblical account as well, in 2 Kings 18. Hezekiah paid him $54 million worth of gold to leave. He did not. He did not leave because that was right after Lachish, and yet we know from the Assyrian account that he went and attacked Jerusalem. So they are trying to save face. They're saying, oh, we just accepted it. We just accepted that he paid us money, just $54 million. That's a lot of money. It wasn't, not compared to what he was taking in other places. And yet still he left them be. This was the only city that the Assyrians were known to attack but not take. These people were ferocious. This is from the stone depiction of the Battle of Lachish. You can see here, impaling people. You can see on the other one archers as well as the tower here. I believe I showed you a close-up of this tower with the slings, shields, and arrows from earlier when we talked about the Davidic period. But this was a massive monumental battle. This was not something that you'd want to see, let alone experience. These were ferocious people, and yet they could not take Jerusalem, and they tried to shake it off. We also have account of Sennacherib's death. In 2 Kings 19:37, and he was worshiping in the house of Nisroch, his god. Adrammelech and Shalrazar, his sons, struck him down with the sword and escaped the land of Ararat. And Esarhaddon, his son, reigned in his place. The Esarhaddon prism, this is his son talking, I am my older brother's youngest brother. By the command of the gods, my father, who engendered me, elevated me firmly in the assembly of my brothers, saying, this is the son who will succeed me. Thereafter my brothers went mad, and whatever was wicked against gods and men they did, and plotted evil. They drew the sword in the midst of Nineveh godlessly. To exercise the kingship against each other, they rushed like young steers. Those rebels, the ones engaged in revolt and rebellion, when they heard of the advance of my campaign, they deserted the army that they relied on and fled to an unknown land. All this aligning perfectly with the Bible and giving a few extra details. From the biblical account, it seems that right after they killed him, they left. We see here that they tried to make a coup of it, but then after seeing what they were against, then they left. From the Assyrian account, we don't know where they went. From the biblical account, we know exactly where they went. So while they don't give us all the information as far as what happened here, they do agree on what they both say, and it fits perfectly together. But this is the end of King Sennacherib and the last Assyrian king we're going to talk about. The next one is King Hazael of Aram. Now this is a king, one of the few that were anointed by Elisha that were not of Israel or Judah descent. I don't think he did anoint any Judean kings, but he anointed Hazael king of Aram. Hazael went to him at behest of his king, Ben-Hadad, and Elisha said, your king is going to get better. Tell your king that he's going to get better, but he's not really. And he told him that, so he went and told his king that, and then killed his king, basically as Elisha had said, suffocating the king and took his throne while he was sick. We see that Shalmaneser III, one of the Assyrian kings, talks about Hazael as a son of nobody. So we know that, just as the Bible says, he was a usurper. This is what was frequently called a king who was a usurper, a son of a nobody. We then see that Hazael fights Joram of Israel and Josiah of Judah in Kings 8. And then in Kings 12, he invades Judah and Philistia, captures Gath. Kings 12 again attacks Jerusalem and receives tribute. It's little wonder that when Elisha anointed him, he cried for all the things that he would do against his people. Now, we see a victory stele of Aram, and then it is a consensus this is Hazael talking. He claims to have killed Joram, son of Ahab of Israel, and Ahaziah, king of Judah. Now, that is, at least on the surface, contradictory to what the Bible says, because a different person on the biblical account kills these men. And that's actually the other person Elisha anointed, King Jehu. Jehu goes and he kills Joram and Ahaziah in 2 Kings 9:14. Now, there's two things that can explain this. One, King Hazael could just be taking credit for this. But two, the last time he saw these people, Joram and Ahaziah, he was fighting them. He actually wounded Joram. So it makes little wonder that the next time he hears of them, that they're dead, and so he thinks, oh, I killed them. Or it could just mean that the Tel Dan stele here just says defeat, not necessarily death. So there's three different ways that this could be interpreted to understand what exactly going on from King Hazael's point of view. But again, it shows that they were fighting, and it shows that they were fighting these people. And it really makes sense when you hear of Elisha's prophecy. I forget the verse that this is in, but around the time where he anoints him. Whoever escapes Hazael, Jehu will kill. And that's exactly what we see here. These two kings escaped Hazael, and Jehu killed them. We also see that he attacked Gath, and we have evidence of this siege system. This is actually one of the oldest, or the oldest, archaeological evidence of a siege system in the world. This is the Philistine city of Gath, and we can see its massive earthworks, or an aerial view of it here. And this is just amazing archaeologically, and exactly with what the Bible says. We see, just from these few kings, mentioned near haphazardly in the Bible, just as a few little footnotes for a good portion of them. Yet we still see that they agree both with the archaeological account, what we know of history, with what the Bible says. Next, we're going to be talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of Judah, since we already talked about Israel. And we're going to go back to Lachish. Now, the Babylonians came in and besieged a number of cities: Gezer, En-Gedi, Beth-Shemesh, Arad, Remet, Rekel, and Lachish. In Lachish, we found some letters. We found it at the gatehouse here, and they parallel Jeremiah 34. Excuse me. And starting in verse 6, then Jeremiah the prophet spoke all these words to Zedekiah, king of Judah, in Jerusalem when the army of the king of Babylon was fighting against Jerusalem and against all the cities of Judah that were left. Lachish and Azekah, for these were the only fortified cities of Judah that remained. In Lachish letter number 4, it says, may Yahweh cause my Lord to hear this very day tidings of good. And now according to everything with which my Lord has sent, this has your servant done. I wrote on the sheet according to everything which you sent me. My Lord be appraised that we are watching out for the fire signals of Lachish according to all the signs which my Lord has given, because we cannot see Azekah. So this is before Lachish fell. He is, whoever's writing this, is waiting for the attack and waiting for the signal. We see in Jeremiah that these were the only two cities left, which are the only two cities mentioned here. And again, these are on pottery sherds. These were their basically scrap pieces of paper. And thankfully, we can keep these instructions. We didn't lose them like we did all the papyri in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, from the biblical account, we see that Jehoiakim dies after he rebels against Nebuchadnezzar. Jehoiachin, in 597, is deported by Nebuchadnezzar, and the prophet Ezekiel with thousands of others. In 2 Kings 24:11, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to the city while his servants were besieging it. And Jehoiachin, the king of Judah, gave himself up to the king of Babylon. The king of Babylon took him prisoner in the 8th year of his reign and carried off all the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. He carried away all Jerusalem and all the officials and all the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives and all the craftsmen and smiths, and he carried away Jehoiachin to Babylon. In the Babylonian Chronicle, it tells us in March of 597 was when the city fell, when he attacked at this time. In the 7th year, the king of Akkad, Nebuchadnezzar, I should have capitalized that in, sorry, mustered his troops, marched to the Hatti land, Jerusalem, Judah, I should say, and besieged the city of Judah. He seized the city and captured the king. This would have been Jehoiachin. He appointed there a king of his own choice. This we know biblically as Jehoiachin's uncle, Mattaniah, which was changed to Zedekiah. And he received its heavy tribute and sent it back to Babylon. So this was not when Jerusalem was destroyed, but it is the step just prior. We see that this Jerusalem chronicle confirms numerous details as well as even a date, showing how Zedekiah was appointed and how he took heavy tribute back to Babylon. Well, we know Zedekiah, son of Josiah, was a weak king with corrupt advisors. From Jeremiah 37, it says, "Neither Zedekiah nor his servants nor the people of the land listened to the words of the Lord that he spoke through Jeremiah the prophet." In 2 Chronicles 36, Zedekiah was 21 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord his God. He did not humble himself before Jeremiah the prophet, who spoke from the mouth of the Lord. In 2 Chronicles 36:13, Zedekiah also rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, who had made him swear by God. He stiffened his neck and hardened his heart against turning to the Lord, the God of Israel. So we see that this was not a good king. Basically, he was given a choice. He could either side with Egypt in a conflict or Nebuchadnezzar. He chose Egypt because he thought he could get out from Nebuchadnezzar's thumb. Whenever Israel sides with Egypt, it does not end well. And it did not end well this time. Now, the Babylonian chronicle breaks off at 594 BC. So we don't know what happens after that. But the siege of Jerusalem lasted about 18 months, which would have been 587 to 586. Lamentations 1:1 says, "How lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow has she become. She who was great among the nations, she who was a princess among the provinces has become a slave." And in 2 Kings 25, we see on the 7th day of the 5th month, in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard, an official of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down. The whole Babylonian army, under the commander of the imperial guard, broke down the walls around Jerusalem. Thankfully, though, if things were not destroyed, then we don't learn very much about them. If they are destroyed, we can learn a lot more. So during peaceful times, it is difficult to learn, but during a destruction time, we can get a lot of information. We see in a place called Area G that has a room full of ash. We see a number of bulla here, 51 seal impressions. That means that this had an area with a number of documents that were all destroyed, unfortunately, the papyri burned up, but the seals maintained. We have talked about this as the House of Bulla before at the bottom of the stepstone structure. We also see a toilet in this area. I pointed that out briefly last time, or the time before, a few times before. Now, based upon the feces in this toilet that they found, they can tell what these people were eating and doing before this. So before this building was destroyed, we see siege conditions. We see poor appetites. We see poor food. In Area H, we see shattered jugs attesting to the destruction, ivory statues destroyed, and even Scythian arrowheads. These were the arrowheads used by the Babylonian army. And this is what the city may have looked like at that time. So we have the middle gate here, the western hill, the original city of David here, Palace of David. Gihon Spring would have been over here, and then come out here in the Pool of Siloam. Palace of Solomon around this area. His tower would have been over around this area. And then the temple. So this would have been something akin to the Jerusalem of Nebuchadnezzar's time. And this is what it looks like from aerial view. We have the Gihon Springs, Pool of Siloam would have been over here, Area E, Area G, and so on. This is the bottom of the stepstone structure near the House of Bulla. So up here would have been David's house, and these would have been some government buildings, basically. Not the word I wanted to use, but it works. This is the toilet. They found a number of things from the food as well as the parasites here. They found archaeological proof of parasites. And these are the arrowheads. These are the Scythian arrowheads used by the Babylonian army. And they found quite a few of them, as you can see. And last, This is what is called the Israelite Tower. It is thought to be the middle gate. That's mentioned in Jeremiah 39, 1 through 3. These are some of the few things that they have found from this time period. Unfortunately, while destruction makes it very easy to find things, Jerusalem is not an easy place to find things in because of who lives there today. It is very hard to dig there. And to dig there, not only do you have to be well known, you have to have good ideas, meaning you have to agree with whoever has control of that land. If they think that you will find something and sell it in such a way as to make them wrong in some way, they do not want you digging there. It is very political, unfortunately, and even then, there has been a lot of rebuilding in these areas. A lot of things are found just by happenstance, especially when we talk about the New Testament time period next time. A number of things that we have found were found when they were building something. And then they would move to another location to build this highway or something like that. Then they'd find something there. But because there's nowhere else to move the highway, they didn't have to dig everything out and move that. And so, unfortunately, a lot of things are lost or destroyed. But we do have a lot of good information just from these finds alone, and are likely to find more the more we're able to dig. Next, we're going to talk about the Exile. Now, we have a few books from the Exile. One is the book of Daniel. And Jeremiah also references this person by Nebo Sarsicum. He is the chief eunuch. And we have found this tablet that mentions him, as well as the title chief eunuch. Chief eunuch is a very rare title. And to find it referencing to this same name usually means that this is the person mentioned in the Bible. It also means that that title goes to that time period, that these people were not writing about a different time period. And this is a very small character. This is not a person that has much to do with things. He's not mentioned regularly. He is mentioned once, with his title mentioned a few times. Yet if this small person exists, if this small figure in the biblical account exists, a throwaway detail basically, how much more true are the things that are actually gone into detail? You don't make something up and happen to get a little detail accurate but miss everything else. That's just not how it's done. Again, showing that this is a reliable account. We also have what is called here the Nabonidus cylinder. It's one of a few from the city of Ur. And it records a person named Nabonidus, his prayer for himself and his son Belshazzar. We know that Babylon fell to the Persians in about 556 to 539 and was taken without a battle during a festival. And this correlates with Daniel 5, with the writing on the wall incident, because in that we see Belshazzar. I went too fast, oh well. I'll leave it on this slide. But we see Belshazzar in the middle of a festival, and at the end, we see that it falls, without a fight, it seems, relatively quickly after that account. So this shows that Belshazzar was actually a true person. For a long time, it was accused that the Bible made this person up. We have Greek historians with their lists of Babylonian kings. Belshazzar is not one of them. They removed them from the Babylonian histories. Yet we see from the Nabonidus cylinder, and as for Belshazzar, my oldest son, my offspring, instill reverence for your great Godhead in his heart, and may he not commit any cultic mistake, and may he be sated with the life of plenitude. Unfortunately, this was not answered. So it shows that he was a real person, because we have reference to him in this archaeological find here, the Nabonidus cylinder. It also shows why Belshazzar could not elevate Daniel to the second person in charge of Babylon. He could only offer him the third highest place because he was in charge after his father. He was in co-regency after his father. So he was only number 2. And that's why he couldn't offer him number 3. Or that's why he could only offer him number 3, and not the place that he was sitting in. We then see in 605 BC that Nebuchadnezzar took Daniel to Babylon. Jerusalem fell in 587. The temple was destroyed. So Daniel was in Babylon from 605 to 539. And that's when Babylon falls to Persia. So that means Daniel would have had wrote his book in about the 6th century, the 500s BC, the late 500s. Yet, this is a problem for secular scientists. They say that it had to be written in the 2nd century. This is during the Maccabean revolt here, 168 to 164, when the Jews were fighting the Greeks. So after Persia fell, Alexander came in, he took over all this land, he died relatively young, His kingdom was then split up pretty quickly. The person in charge of his kingdom in Israel, him and the Israelites had a bit of a falling out. And as such, that led to the Maccabean revolt. You can read about this in the book, the Maccabees book, 1st and 2nd Maccabees. That is just a historical book, but you can read about it as a historical book. And we see that the Jews ended up winning, and at least for a time. And this is where they got the tradition of Hanukkah, is because of the Maccabean revolt. Well, they say, the secular scientists say, that Daniel had to have been written at this time in order to give a national identity to the Israelites, as a way of bringing them all together. There's a few problems with this, though. Well, I'll get to those problems in a minute. The reason why they say that had to have been written here is because Daniel is so good about prophesying things in easy-to-understand language. We talk about the Medo-Persian Empire in Daniel 7 and 8, the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire. All these pointed out in Daniel with just way too easy to understand words, way too easy to understand meaning. And as such, it cannot be written in the 5th century, according to secular scholars, because of these prophecies. Because if prophecy is real, that means miracles are real. And if miracles are real, that means God at least may be real. And they can't have that. It just doesn't fit with their worldview. And so they say it has to be the 2nd century because that is the best time for it to be written. The problems with this are, one, the book of Daniel, it is written in Aramaic. But not just any Aramaic, it is written in an imperial Aramaic. That is the Aramaic in use from the 600 to 330 BC. Nowhere near the 2nd century. And we know that because we found documents. We are now at the stage of history where we can find paper, papyri. This papyri is a marriage document from the Elephantine papyri in Egypt, dated July 3rd, 449 BC. Based upon the wording in this, we can say that this was written about the same time as Daniel. Based upon how it's written, based upon the words used. The same way you can read the King James Bible and know it wasn't written in the last century. We also have the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, we have a copy of Daniel, and the earliest copy is from the 2nd century. That means that it had to have been written, dispersed very widely, and accepted as canon within about 15 years. That's impossible. That's impossible because these were found in the Qumran community. That's where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. Even back in this time period, that was in the middle of nowhere. That's why these people went out in the middle of nowhere, because they didn't want to be around people. They were trying to be a religious, secluded community. Yet they knew that this was canon. Based upon their writings, we know they accepted Daniel as canon. That cannot be done in 15 years. It makes no sense with the information that we have for putting Daniel in the 2nd century, but putting his book in the 500s BC makes perfect sense. We also have a mentioning of Esther. So the book of Esther takes place in Persia, specifically one of its capitals in Susa. Persia had 4 capitals. We have Susa, unfortunately it's a little small on my screen, Ecbatana, Persepolis, and Persagadi. So these 2 down here, Susa, and the one on top. Later, Babylon served as a capital until Esther's husband came in and destroyed it. We have here Susa, Esther's Susa. This would have been the main city. This is the royal citadel and the palace. And you can see here the palace today. It is a wonderful foundation of the palace, and you can see just incredible detail in it. Susa was the winter capital. It was about 700 acres, has 15 levels of occupation from the Elamite period up until the Islamic age, and that goes back to the 1900s BC. Darius, the father-in-law of Esther, about 520 BC, 35 years prior to Esther, built up the palace and the citadel. So basically, he's the one that put all this up. So it was still brand new, or near brand new at the time of Esther. And with the proper permits, you can actually walk from the woman's quarters to the throne room, just like Esther did. And this is the outline of the palace. This would have been the harem chambers, the throne room in the hall, inner court, middle court, outer court, and the king's gate. These are the places where the book of Esther mainly takes place. On the east side of the palace, between the palace and the city, we have this gatehouse with a little moat there that's now dried. And this was a well-to-do place. It was the main entrance to the palace, and just like many other places, many other peoples at this time, the gate was the place where business was done. So you had to have some authority to be sitting here, and we find Mordecai sitting here. In Esther 2, it says, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. That would have been, right here, would have been where that occurred. And what is very interesting about this is that while he was saved from this assassination attempt, it was a later assassination attempt that ended up killing him. But all these people, all of these names, this place fits perfectly with the book of Esther. It has to have been written from this time and place. And with how we know where everything was, it fits perfectly. Esther 5:1. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room, opposite the entrance of the palace. Let me go back to the map. She was standing here, opposite here, just like Esther 5 says. This outline, this building, is perfectly depicted, maybe not easily depicted, but perfectly depicted in the book of Esther. And we can walk that place. The part of the palace where the woman's banquet was held was evidently not the woman's quarters, which are called the house of the women in Esther 2:3. The woman's banquet was evidently held in the king's private residence, which also included the courtyards. So we can clear up some understanding or some terms that are used in Esther with known locations now. Before, we didn't have this outline. We didn't really know what she meant, or whoever wrote Esther meant with some of these terms, some of these phrases. Now that we have the outline, we can see clearly what was going on. We can see clearly because we have the place that this tells us about. And so you can see, again, inner courtyard, middle courtyard, outer courtyard highlighted here. King's quarters, western gate, and women's quarters right here, sorry. And so you can see all these placed perfectly, and it fits perfectly with the book of Esther. And if you wanted to, you could go here and you could tour this place and, while reading the book of Esther, walk where she walked. And that's just very interesting, considering she is a minor character in the biblical account. She only has a few chapters in a book about her. And I can't go on without mentioning Xerxes. So Esther's husband would have been this man here. This is a depiction when his father Darius was ruling, so he would have been the crown prince. So this is what Esther's husband may have looked like. He is recorded as saying, I am not hot-tempered. Whatever befalls me in battle, I hold firmly. I am ruling firmly in my own will. The man who is cooperative according to his cooperation, thus I reward him. Who does harm, him according to the harm I punish. This makes sense with what we know of the biblical account of Xerxes. I mean, he got hot-tempered when he felt Esther was threatened, but otherwise, this fits him to a T. As far as the events of Esther, we have it here as far as our timeline goes. So 1:3, Xerxes holds a banquet. That would have been about 483. He goes off to fight the Greeks. He loses not just to 300 Spartans, but to a few thousand other Greeks. There's the 300 Spartans that are most highlighted. Esther then enters the picture, about 479. And then as far as the archaeological account, as far as the historical record, Herodotus breaks off his account of Xerxes in his 7th year. So we don't really have much else extra-biblically about Esther because she doesn't come in until after he stops writing. But between 474 and 473 BC would have been when the intrigue with Haman occurs. So there is some time period here. And the last thing about Xerxes, we see that, oh no, sorry, this isn't Xerxes, this is Cyrus. I misread that. Apologies. So that's it about Xerxes. On to Cyrus, the last king. So in Daniel 1:21, we see that Cyrus, the king of Persia, captures Babylon. This would have been his emblem. This would have been the states at that time. Cyrus is prophesied in Isaiah 44, who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd and will accomplish all that I please. Or Isaiah 45, this is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I take hold of, to subdue nations before him and to strip kings of their armor. This is very problematic for those who don't believe in prophecy. Cyrus prophesied well before he was even born. And we have, again, a very firm date on Isaiah, nowhere near when Cyrus was alive. We have him recorded a few different places. One, he names himself Cyrus. You can see a depiction of him here, and then a drawing of that. And just for your information, that's Alexander the Great. I'm just saying that he was better than Alexander. Sorry, couldn't help it. And that's saying something, because Greek sources hated Persians, yet they held Cyrus II, the Great, in high esteem. So even the people that hated Persians thought he was a good guy. And that's because, well, I'll get to that because later, sorry. We also have the Akkadians talking about him as well. I'm getting ahead of myself. But that's because Cyrus declared, had not a prophecy, he allowed people that were captured by the Babylonians to return to their homelands. Can't think of the word I want to use there. But he allowed everybody captured by Babylon to return and build their temples. This is exactly what we see in the biblical account. We see that the Jews were allowed to go back home and even help them. Now we know from the archaeological account they weren't the only ones. Now, Cyrus didn't do this necessarily out of the goodness of his own heart. He did this because he wanted all the gods to think highly of him. But we have a number of details confirmed in the biblical account. We have Babylon falling without a fight. We have him being welcomed. This public policy about returning captured peoples, which is held as the first example of human rights by many. And he did this to placate the gods so that he would have good fortune, which is, again, everything except that is consistent with the biblical account, which that you have to read into. But all this is consistent with what we know of Cyrus biblically. So in summary, we talked about Israel, a few of the kings, Omri, Ahab, Jehu, and Hoshea. We talked about some kings of Judah. We talked about Isaiah, Hezekiah, and again, Lachish and Isaiah a little bit. We talked about the foreign kings, and even while in exile. And it's just really cool, some of the things that we can find. We actually have mention of some of the kings in exile. I'm talking about the Judah kings, the Judahite kings. I didn't include it in this because it's very small detail, but it's very likely to be him. And there's a lot of other things that I couldn't include. Unfortunately, there's just too much, and too little time and too much time in this time period. Next time, we're going to be going over the New Testament period, and we're going to be finishing up that for the next few classes. But there are a few other sources on here before we go into that. Canon Fodder, as well as Text and Canon Institute. Those are two places if you want to know more about the canon, about the Old Testament scriptures and the New Testament scriptures for that matter. And so if you're more interested as far as when the book of Daniel was written or when the book of Isaiah was written, since we did touch on that here, those are some places that you can go to. Unfortunately, for a full discussion on that, that would take a whole other class series. But for now, any questions, any concerns, any burning thoughts? I understand. All right. Well, thank you.